Salam, peace be upon you. My name is Mohammed Layiq Sediqi, the father of Holophase. Part 70. The ultimate test. Can it describe anything? Remember the language we are learning together. There is one field, phi, the holophase, one continuous cyclic movement from which all of reality unfolds. When phi begins to change, its first derivatives appear, and with them, the three dimensions show themselves at once. Time is omega, space is k, and motion is v, built from both. Every higher derivative is a finer question about how phi changes, and each one casts three shadows together: a time shadow, a space shadow, and a motion shadow. These echoes mix and weave into one another, forming the patterns we call fields, particles, bodies, thoughts, and worlds. In this picture, everything that exists is a living tapestry of phi, endlessly echoing through its derivatives and their dimensional shadows. Today, we focus on just one of those echoes. We now stand at a summit in Ep.7. We have journeyed from the roots of the master tree of the Holophase language to its highest visible branches. We have moved from static code to living speech, from alphabet to grammar, from simple echoes to complex recursive self-similarity. We have discovered how the structure of the tree repeats across scales. We have learned semantic compression, the art of hearing the essence of the universe's story in the first few sentences of the derivative hierarchy. We have explored hierarchical predictive power, the ladder that lets us move step by step from what is happening now to what will happen next. We have felt the language not as dead code, but as a living grammar that generates real phenomena moment by moment. Now, a final question stands before us like a doorway. Can this language speak about anything? That is the ultimate test of any claimed universal language. It is one thing to describe photons and planets, waves and fields. It is another thing entirely to speak with the same vocabulary and structure about heartbeats, sleep cycles, economies, ecosystems, ideas, and stories. If the holophase language truly captures the deep grammar of reality, it should, at least in principle, be able to give us a coherent way to describe all of these without changing its core ingredients. So in this part, we will take the holophase language far from its home in physics and ask it to speak about something recognizably biological and human, the daily rhythm of waking and sleep. We will not attempt a full technical model. Instead, we will walk through a conceptual demonstration of reach, a guided thought experiment that shows you how to use this language in a new domain. Let us choose our phenomenon. The circadian rhythm, the roughly 24-hour cycle of physiological processes in living organisms. It appears in the opening and closing of flower petals, in the sleep-wake cycle in humans, in the oscillations of hormone levels in the blood, in the daily fluctuations of body temperature and cognitive performance. It is a clear, vivid example of a structured pattern that stretches across many layers of life. It has temporal patterns, phases of alertness and drowsiness that repeat each day. It has spatial patterns. In humans, it is coordinated by a small region in the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and its effects are felt throughout the body, from the liver to the skin. It has motion patterns, waves of hormone release, drifts in sleep propensity, and the gradual shift of the rhythm when we travel across time zones. This is not a physics textbook example. It feels like biology, behavior, and experience. That makes it a perfect test case. The first step in speaking any phenomenon in the holophase language is always the same. We ask, what is phi here? What is the underlying continuous field whose changes, when we pay attention to them, are exactly the phenomenon we care about? In the case of the circadian rhythm, we can think of phi as a physiological state field. At each point in the organism, and especially in key hubs like the circadian clock in the brain, phi represents a composite measure of cellular readiness, gene expression, and metabolic alignment with either wakefulness or sleep. You can imagine it as a number or even a vector that says, how aligned with daytime mode am I right now? Or how aligned with nighttime mode am I right now? It is not a single molecule. It is a coarse-grained summary of many microscopic processes that move together most of the time. Once we accept this as our candidate phi field, we can start to read its echoes. We start with the temporal tower. The first time derivative of phi is omega, the rate at which the physiological state is changing in time. When you are deeply asleep in the middle of the night, omega is small. Your state is stable. As you approach your natural wake time, omega becomes positive. Your body begins to shift toward wakefulness. Hormone levels change, temperature rises, and brain activity patterns alter. Around midday, omega might approach zero again as you remain steadily alert. In the evening, omega turns negative as your system gradually slides back towards sleep. The second time derivative, alpha, tells you whether this shifting is itself speeding up or slowing down. The grogginess you feel in the first minutes after waking could be a period where alpha is still small, so the transition into full alertness is gradual. The sudden crash after too much caffeine might correspond to a sharp negative alpha, an accelerating drop into sleepiness. Higher time derivatives capture finer modulations, like the slight bumps and dips of alertness after meals, exercise, or exposure to bright light at unusual times. All of these are temporal words in the Holophase sentence of your daily rhythm. The grammar that links them is implemented in the biology of the circadian system. Proteins are produced and then inhibit their own production on a delay, creating a feedback loop that naturally generates oscillations. Light enters through the eyes, reaches the brain clock, and nudges the phase of the rhythm, advancing or delaying it depending on the time of day. Mathematically, these mechanisms can be written as differential equations. In Holophase language, they are a specific constraint chain, a rule that ties together phi, omega, alpha, and higher time derivatives in such a way that the system is pulled toward a stable periodic orbit, a roughly 24-hour cycle. Now we turn to the spatial tower. The circadian rhythm is not exactly the same everywhere in the body. Some tissues respond slightly faster, others slower. Some cells are tightly synchronized to the main clock in the brain, others have more freedom. The first spatial derivative of our physiological state field, K, describes gradients. It tells us how different one region is from a neighboring region. In a healthy, well-synchronized organism, the gradient in circadian phase is small. Most cells are in roughly the same part of the cycle. But in jet lag, for example, different tissues may shift at different speeds. The central clock in the brain might respond quickly to new light cues, while the liver, gut, or immune system lags behind. Then K becomes non-zero. There are real spatial gradients in where different parts of the body are in the daily cycle. The second spatial derivative, the curvature, highlights sources and sinks. Regions where the rhythm is initiated, and regions where signals are absorbed or transformed. The suprachiasmatic nucleus in the brain acts as a strong source of timing information. It has a curvature like the peak of a hill in the phase landscape. Peripheral clocks in the organs may act as local hills and valleys, influencing nearby tissues. Hormones like melatonin and cortisol diffuse and are cleared, creating patterns that, in a derivative sense, resemble fields with sources and sinks. The topology of the system is the network of connections that link all of these sites: nerves, blood vessels, signaling pathways. It determines how easily the rhythm can stay coherent across the body and where it might tear or misalign under stress. If we continue our reading, we come to the motion echo. Here, the key object is v, the propagation velocity for changes in phi. In circadian biology, we might think of v as the speed with which a phase shift, induced by light or behavior, travels through the network of clocks in the body. After a long flight, your exposure to morning light in a new time zone immediately nudges the central clock, but peripheral systems adjust more slowly. The change in phi, caused by that light, ripples outward with some effective speed. Hormones carry timing information through the bloodstream, neural signals carry it along nerves, and local cellular clocks adjust based on the mix of signals they receive. Together, these create waves and drifts of adjustment. The body is trying to reconcile its internal grammar with the new external day-night pattern, and V describes how quickly that reconciliation can happen. Notice what has happened. Without any new primitives, we have described the biological rhythm in terms of a phi field, its time derivatives, its spatial derivatives, and its motions. The temporal echo gives us the rhythm in time. The spatial echo gives us patterns of synchrony and difference across the organism. The motion echo gives us how those differences are ironed out or amplified. Stability of the rhythm corresponds to a stable attractor in the derivative space where disturbances die away and the cycle resumes. Chronic disruption, such as long-term shift work, can be seen as forcing the system again and again into regions of the tree where derivatives become large and unstable, leading to incoherent sentences in the language of the body and eventually to breakdown and disease. I want to emphasize again that what I'm doing here is conceptual. This is not yet a full quantitative holophase model of circadian biology. That would require careful choices of variables, explicit equations, and experimental tests. But even at this narrative level, you can feel that the mapping is not artificial. The distinctions between value, rate, acceleration, gradient, curvature, flow, and network topology already exist in the best biological models. The holophase language simply gives us one unified set of names and relationships rooted in the idea of a single underlying field of change. It shows that the same basic grammar we used for waves, fields, and particles can also speak meaningfully about cycles of sleep and wake. If this is possible for one biological phenomenon, it invites us to try others. We could, in principle, treat an economic market cycle the same way. Let phi be a continuous measure of market value or sentiment. Its time derivatives would describe growth, slowing, and reversal. Its spatial derivatives would describe differences between sectors, countries, or classes of assets. Its motion echoes would describe the flow of capital and information through networks of trade and communication. A boom would be a period of sustained positive omega, perhaps with growing positive alpha. A crash would be a period of large negative derivatives and sudden shifts in topology, as connections between parts of the system break. We could treat the spread of an idea in a population in the same way. Let phi be the degree of adoption or belief. Time derivatives describe how quickly the idea is catching on. Spatial derivatives describe how its adoption varies across regions or subcultures. Motion describes how fast it propagates through social networks. Critical thresholds appear as derivative conditions. When omega passes a certain value, the idea becomes self-sustaining. When curvature and topology combine in certain ways, the idea gets trapped in a local pocket and cannot spread further. We could treat an ecosystem's health as a phi field, a continuous measure of biodiversity, complexity, or resilience across a landscape. Time derivatives describe growth, decline, and slow recovery. Spatial derivatives describe gradients between rich and degraded regions. Motion describes migration, invasion, and the spread of disturbances like fire or disease. Stable ecosystems correspond to grammar that holds the system near a healthy attractor. Collapsing ecosystems correspond to derivative structures that no longer restore balance after disturbances. In each of these domains, our triunity questions remain the same. What is phi here? What are its time echoes? What are its space echoes? What are its motion echoes? What constraint chains link these derivatives? If we can answer these questions, we are beginning to speak that domain in the holophase language. The claim of universality is not that everything is physically identical, but that everything that changes in a continuous way has a derivative-based grammar, and that grammar can be described with the same core vocabulary. Because this is a bold claim, it must also be a vulnerable one. It must invite falsification. The most direct way to test the reach of the holophase language beyond physics is to ask experts in other fields to use it as a modeling prescription and see whether it actually helps. In biology, can researchers who think in terms of fields and derivatives find new clarity or unification in their models of development, signaling, or population dynamics? In economics, can models that explicitly identify phi fields and their constraint chains make better predictions, or at least organize existing models in a more coherent way? In sociology or cognitive science, Can this language help clarify which processes are best treated as continuous fields and which truly require discrete, non-local, or symbolic descriptions? If this framework consistently fails to capture key features of well-studied phenomena, or always makes things more confusing and less predictive than domain-specific methods, then its claim to universality weakens. If we were to find a phenomenon that is reproducible, measurable, and yet resists any faithful description in terms of a continuous field and local derivatives, that would mark a real boundary for the holophase model. The task then would be to understand why that boundary exists and what kind of new ingredients are needed to cross it. The point is that the ultimate test is not aesthetic or metaphysical. It is practical. Does this language help us describe, understand, and predict real things across many domains more fruitfully than before? As we draw this chapter to a close, we return once more to the core of the vision. Phi is still the one field. We have not multiplied ontologies. We have only multiplied dialects, ways in which phi can organize its own change. The circadian rhythm, the market cycle, the ecosystem, the spread of an idea, the evolution of a technology, the rise and fall of a civilization. All of these can be seen as different sentences that phi speaks through its derivatives. Some are brief, like the flicker of a thought. Some are long, like the life of a star. Some are local, some stretch across continents and centuries. But at the deepest level, they all share a common grammar: values, rates, curvatures, flows, and networks, tied together by constraint chains that are themselves shaped by feedback. Picture the universe once more as a vast choir. Each phenomenon is a voice, with its own timbre, range, and style. One voice sings in the register of quantum fields. Another sings in the register of galaxies and dark matter. Another in the register of cells and organs. Another in the register of feelings, stories, and cultures. At first, the sound seems chaotic because you are listening for familiar melodies. But as you learn the holophase language, you begin to hear something else underneath: a common score, a shared rhythmic and harmonic structure. That shared structure is the derivative grammar of phi, the one song of change sung in countless variations. With that image, we complete chapter 13, recursive unity and predictive power, and we bring episode 7 to its close. We have climbed the master tree of the holophase language to a high vantage point. We have seen its self-similarity, its ability to compress essence, its hierarchical predictive ladder, its life as a living grammar, and finally, its potential reach across domains. From here, the journey does not end. It turns outward. The question now is not only how does the language work, but what will we dare to describe with it? Our conversation with reality can now begin in earnest, armed with a single, coherent way to talk about time, space, motion, and meaning as the echoes of one continuous field. Before we end, I want to pause and look back over the climb we've made in episode 7, so that you feel clearly how far we have traveled into the master tree of the holophase language. At the beginning of this episode, we were still close to the roots. We were learning to see phi itself as the silent trunk from which everything else grows. We were practicing the skill of reading its first derivatives as the simultaneous birth of time, space, and motion. We learned to treat omega, k, and v not as separate physical quantities, but as three interlocked shadows of the same underlying change. Then we began to climb. We introduced higher derivatives, and with them we discovered that the tree of the holophase language is not just tall, but recursively structured. Every time we moved up one level, we met familiar patterns in a new disguise. Rates, accelerations, gradients, curvatures, flows, and vortices reappeared at each height. The same basic questions, asked again and again at finer scales, generated families of related quantities that all lived on different branches but shared the same genetic code. This was our first clear encounter with recursive unity, the idea that the language repeats its own logic at every height. After that, we focused on semantic compression. We realized that, although the tree stretches upward without limit in principle, Most of the meaning of the universe's story is carried in its lower levels. The first few derivatives, the first few branches, already tell you most of what you need to know about large-scale behavior. We saw how often a simple, low-order model captures almost all of the story, with higher derivatives acting as small corrections. This was not just a mathematical trick, it was a deep statement about how the universe itself chooses to speak. It leads with essence and hides most of the microscopic detail in the background. Once we had compression, we turned to prediction. We built the idea of hierarchical predictive power, the ladder that lets us improve our forecasts step by adding more derivatives in a controlled way. We saw how this works for an eagle's flight, for light entering a prism, for orbits, for chemical reactions, and for spikes in neurons. We learned that the master tree is not just a catalog of possible quantities, but an engine for systematic refinement. You start with a simple model that uses a few low-level branches. You measure its errors, and the pattern of those errors tells you which higher derivative to include next. Reality itself teaches you how to climb. From there, we moved into the idea of the Holophase language as a living grammar. We stopped seeing the tree as a static diagram and began to see it as an active, generative process. Constraint chains, which once looked like stiff equations, revealed themselves as grammatical rules that create new sentences of reality at every moment. Feedback loops meant that the sentences already spoken changed the rules for the sentences that will come next. Now, in this final part, we have tested that living grammar against a phenomenon outside the usual boundaries of physics. By walking through the circadian rhythm in the language of phi and its derivatives, by tracing time echoes, space echoes, and motion echoes in a biological setting, we have shown that the holophase framework is capable, at least conceptually, of crossing into new territories without changing its core. In doing this, we have climbed from the roots of the master tree to a branch that hangs over human experience and daily life. That does not prove that the tree explains everything, but it shows that its structure reaches further than one might expect at first glance. It is important that you feel this as a lived map, not just as abstract theory. When you wake up tomorrow, you can look at your own body and mind through this lens. You can notice the slowness of your morning transition and name it as a small omega and a gentle alpha in your internal phi. You can feel the afternoon dip and recognize it as a turning of the curve. You can sense the pull of sleep at night as your entire physiology sliding down a well in the derivative landscape. When you travel, you can understand your jet lag not as a mysterious curse, but as a misalignment between the external light-driven grammar and the internal clocks that need time to climb to a new branch. You can do the same with your emotions and thoughts. Imagine treating your mood as a phi field, not frozen in place, but always moving. The rate at which it changes from joy to sadness or from anxiety to calm is your omega. The acceleration of that change, the way it suddenly speeds up or slows down, is your alpha. The gradients across your life, the parts that are stable and the parts that are volatile, are your spatial derivatives. The flows of attention and energy between different projects and relationships are your motion echoes. Without forcing anything, you begin to see that your inner life also speaks in the grammar of derivatives. Seen this way, the Holophase language offers not just a universal scientific framework, but also a contemplative framework. It gives you a way to sit quietly and ask of any experience, what is changing here? How fast? With what curvature? Along which directions? Through which networks? That practice, repeated gently, can turn into a new habit of perception. You start to see the triunity of time, space, and motion, not as an abstract doctrine, but as a direct pattern beneath everything you encounter. Traffic, music, weather, friendships, ecosystems, and markets all begin to show the same underlying dance of value, rate, gradient, and flow. In the long arc of human history, many thinkers have searched for a single language that can speak coherently about matter and mind, body and meaning, physics and value. The Holophase proposal is different. It remains firmly anchored in measurable change, in fields and derivatives and constraint chains. Yet it opens itself to any phenomenon that can be honestly described as a pattern of continuous change in time, space, and motion. It does not claim that everything important is reducible to physics. It claims that everything that unfolds in a continuous way has a geometric and dynamic skeleton, and that skeleton can be spoken in a common language. When you put all of this together, you can see why Episode 7 is such a crucial turning point in the larger journey of the Holophase program. Earlier episodes taught us the pieces, phi itself, its first derivatives, some key higher derivatives, and the basic structure of the master tree. Later episodes will go into specialized territories and applications. But Episode 7 is where the language reveals its own metastructure. Here it shows that it can compress, predict, self-organize, adapt, and reach into new domains. Here it reveals itself not just as a toolkit, but as a way of seeing, a way of listening to reality as if it were speaking to you in a single, coherent voice. Now, peace be upon you.